All right, let's rock and roll. We're on 2.3 now, hemostasis. So we talked about the bone marrow, we talked about hematopoiesis. This one's a little bit off the beaten path in terms of immunology, but I did want to talk about it because a fast track to infection, right, is an open wound, is a laceration. Referencing last unit, we know our barriers are really helpful in preventing infection of many kinds. So when that is ruptured, well, we want to make sure we get that patched up ASAP. And that's what hemostasis is, right? I guess stasis like still and hemo, blood. So we want to clog that area with some still clotted blood. We're going to break this up into primary, secondary, and fibrinolysis. Fibrinolysis. So first things first, we want to form a plug. We want to plug the hole, right? If you saw that a pipe in your house was springing a leak, you'd put your thumb up to it, right? That's basically what we're doing. But from the inside of the pipe. First things first, vasoconstriction. So on this lovely diagram here, it has it as its own phase. I'm going to include it with primary hemostasis. I think it just depends on the textbook you got. But vasoconstriction, right, that's referring to vessel constricting. So this vessel is going to decrease in diameter. Right, so if it's more narrow, now this blood has to work more to get through. So it's going to increase blood pressure. Increase blood pressure and decrease flow to the region. Right, if it's a more narrow tube to go through, it's going to be harder for all those cells to get through. And we want that, right? If I've sprung a leak, we want less water in that area. We want to lose the least fluid, least blood possible. So that's what we do. Constrict the flow, minimize blood loss. We know, or the body knows, because whenever we get a damaged blood vessel cell, it releases a compound called endothelin. So that lets us know, hey, we got damage down here. Start closing the loop. All right, so that's step one, constrict. Next, platelet adhesion. So exposed collagen in the vessel walls is going to bind this cute factor here. Let's look at this diagram. So this is my blood vessel wall. And within the wall are my fibers, okay, my supportive mesh network. I want you to think like behind your drywall, you're probably going to find, electrical work. You're going to find AC stuff. You're going to find internet stuff, right? You're going to find things that shouldn't be exposed to your inside space. Same deal here. My collagen is a fibrous compound that's used to support my vessels. In no way should my platelets ever see collagen, because that would mean that my wall is ruptured. So the body knows this. It knows this. And on the collagen are these little tags. These little tags are called von Willebrand factor. And when a platelet sees von Willebrand factor, it binds to it. It says, okay, it has a receptor for that and connects to it immediately. So von Willebrand factor is hanging off that collagen, the platelet binds to it, and that is going to cause a cascade of events here. So once the platelet binds VWF, it's activated now. It's go time, right? It sees the collagen and knows that, well, I shouldn't be seeing the pipes behind my wall. That means something's wrong. So that platelet, it changes shape and it releases a bunch of clotting factors. And those clotting factors, they tell the platelets, come here. Come here. We need more platelets to the area. We've sprung a leak here, and I can't do it by myself, so get more and more and more platelets. So more come. Excuse me. Get rid of that. So the platelet bound VWF, and now it changes shape. Now it's all funky wonky right here. And then it secretes a bunch of clotting factors. All right, basically saying, come help. Come help. And then its friends come. We get more platelets recruited to the region. So he's having fun. He binds to his buddy. He's like, all right, let's plug up this hole. We do not want our blood leaving the body. And that's what we get. So all these red blood cells, and we have platelets hanging out in them. We've got a fiber network that we'll talk about in just a moment. But those platelets binding to that von Willebrand factor is going to activate this long pathway here. All right. What I wanted to stress is this is a really cool example of something called a positive feedback mechanism. Now, it's quite rare in biology that we have this, or I should say that it's beneficial. A positive feedback mechanism is a situation in which the input causes more output, and that output causes more input. In this case, in blood clotting, classic example. I bind to exposed von Willebrand factor. That recruits platelets. The platelet binds and then releases clotting factors. Those clotting factors recruit more platelets. More platelets bind and release clotting factors, which recruit more platelets. More platelets recruit or bind and release more clotting factors. You see what I'm trying to do here? It cascades, it keeps going and going and going. More come, causing more to produce output, which causes more input. It's a cascading effect. And you can see in delicate cases with all of our different cellular machinery where we wouldn't want that to happen, right? That amplifies the signal to infinitum, and that could be bad. But in the case of this, it's perfect because it's a means to an end. At a certain point, the blood's going to get clotted or the hole's going to get plugged and the stimulus will stop. All right, so if it's useful if we want to terminate a loop. But in most cases, the terminus of a loop would mean death. Okay, so we don't want that. So clotting, great example. Another excellent example is partition, is birth. So the oxytocin released is going to cause strong uterine contractions, which causes stretch of the cervix. And one of the inputs for oxytocin release is cervical stretch. So we're going round the roundabout. What's it? The merry-go-round, geez. But that's good because it's a means to an end. There's a terminus to that loop. That's birth of the baby, okay? So positive feedback mechanisms, I'm definitely going to ask something about those. It's really important to understand those, and I want you to know those leaving my class. So positive feedback mechanisms. Input causing more output, which causes more input, which causes more output. Like a toilet bowl. Very, very bad in most cases, except these two and a couple others. But these are the Shangri-La for good positive feedback mechanisms. All right. That's primary hemostasis. Let's talk about secondary. This is overwhelming, and I'm going to simplify it over yonder. In secondary hemostasis, basically we have all of these clotting factors now floating around in the blood, and they are constantly communicating with one another. You have tons and tons and tons, just all the way from, I forget the number, just give me like 20 plus. You have a lot of clotting factors, and they're all talking to each other in some sort of way. They have their interconnected pathway that this is referring to over here, but I don't want you to have to know all of this. That's overwhelming. What I do want you to know is that all of that communication eventually culminates in factor X. That's one of your clotting factors, factor X. Factor X is super important because it activates something called thrombin. Why do I care about thrombin? Well, thrombin is super important because it activates fibrin. And fibrin is a really helpful molecule because it forms a polymer. Polymer just means a a network of that compound. It forms a mesh network. And that helps fit the clot to whatever puncture, lesion, wound that we have. Okay? So that makes it fit nice and taut, like a bespoke suit. Right? It's tailored for that rupturing. That way we plug the clot in its own bespoke manner. So let's look at this pathway here. So not only does collagen have the von Willebrand factor on it. Okay. Come on now. Not only does it have that, but it also has a negative charge to it, which also recruits more platelets. So we'll get more platelets and more clotting factors that way. And you have the various tissue clotting factors, or tissue and clotting factors that I mentioned here, just that convoluted pathway that complex diagram was referencing. All I care about is that leads to factor X. And factor X leads to prothrombinase. Okay, so prothrombinase, anytime you see ACE, that usually means enzyme. So that is going to break down prothrombin into thrombin. Anytime you see pro in front of a compound, that usually means it's inactive. Okay, so you need something to activate it and turn it into thrombin, which is the activated form. Another hint at that, anytime something ends in, oh, there it is, in OGN. OGN, that's also a hint that it's inactive. These two things, inactive forms of a molecule is called a zymogen. Inactive form. All right. So that's why it's a little convoluted. Bear with me. It really only is 2 or 3 steps, or 3 steps that I want you to know. We get to factor X. Factor X causes the activation of thrombin, and then thrombin causes the activation of fibrin. That's all. That's all I really want you to know. Once fibrin is activated, it immediately starts forming polymers with itself. So it immediately starts finding other polymer fibers, and they line up with each other, and they form this lovely network. And that network is going to help fashion the clot directly for whatever hole, whatever lesion, whatever rupture that has been created. So in primary hemostasis, we formed the platelet plug, and that was that positive feedback mechanism, getting all of those platelets in the right place. And then the polymer comes in and fits it to the area, forming our blood clot. Okay? But obviously, we don't want the clot there forever. If you guys have heard of strokes and embolisms and things of that nature, well, that is a clot that didn't get broken down correctly. So the clots can be bad, can be a problem. If we have a big old clump of cells that get down to a capillary, well, then that's going to clog that capillary. So we need to break down these clots after they have done their job. So fibrinolysis, lysis, means breakdown. So it's the breakdown of those fibrin polymers. A concept or a compound called TPA activates your plasmin that was once plasminogen. So another example, something needs to be activated. All right? And then plasmin is excellent at breaking down fibrin polymers. So you constantly have this ebb and flow. You have TPA floating around just as much as you have like factor X floating around. You have these compounds floating around, so there's constant tug of war, but it's just it depends on the supply and demand. if I'm actively bleeding out, well, then this pathway is going to beat out this pathway, right? If I'm no longer hemorrhaging, then the fibrinolysis is going to win and break down that clot. Let's talk about some bleeding disorders really quick, and we'll end it there. Hemophilia, I'm sure you've heard of that before. That is that bleeding disorder. So you have impaired secondary hemostasis, and this is due to typically factor 7 and factor 9 issues, but all that means is I don't get to factor X in a reasonable amount of time. So I don't form prothrombinase. My prothrombinase doesn't activate my thrombin, and my thrombin doesn't activate my fibrin. I don't get a good clot to form. So I forget the name of the lad, but in the Russian royal family, there was that lad, and he couldn't do much at all without, if he scuffed his knee, he would have a horrible bleeding episode. So hemophilia is really quite a remarkably scary disease. Von Willebrand disease. We can be deficient in the factor. We can have defective von Willebrand factor, so it could be like malformed or just not operating right. Whatever the case is, it's not doing its job. So you don't get good platelet binding, and then you don't get good platelet recruitment. Then on the other end, you have thrombotic disorders, which can be summarized as hypercoagulation issues. There's something called factor V Leiden that causes overcoagulation due to a mutation in that factor. It doesn't bind a protein correctly. Prothrombin mutations typically lead to too much prothrombin in the body, so that prothrombin ends up incorrectly getting activated, and then this pathway starts rocking and rolling when it's not meant to. So that can be very problematic. And another cool one, antiphospholipid syndrome. This is also hypercoagulation related, but it's antibody mediated. So you see how I tied it back to immunity? I'm just awesome like that. So that antiphospholipid, so we end up, for whatever reason, it's actually an autoimmune issue. Autoimmune issue. And for whatever reason, your body makes antibodies against phospholipids. And you have phospholipids everywhere. Those are what makes up your cell membranes. So that's going to lead to a lot of damage, maybe some bleeding, and now we have overexhausted the clotting pathway. So it's hypercoagulation due to all that damage caused by your own antibodies, which is crazy. I want you to think about what cells make your antibodies, because we're going to be talking about those all day on 2.4. So that in class it'll be Monday. Yeah. What makes my antibodies? We're going to figure that out big time. Then on Wednesday we'll talk only about antibodies. And then on Friday we'll talk about some diseases associated with that stuff. All right. Thank you guys very much for your attention and continued support. Have a good one.